Okay, today we're going to look at Post-Impressionist painting. Post-Impressionist painting, really a bunch of wonderful paintings, a lot of things going on. I'm going to try to earn my keep today by showing you some of the things that connect these paintings and talk about Post-Impressionism a little bit. But really what you want today is to look at some of these really nice paintings, and then after you see this video, you can go and look at some more, figure out who's your favorite, for example, and go and look at quite a lot more paintings. These are a lot of very prolific painters that we're looking at today. So we are going to then talk about postmodernism. Put that up there. Okay. Now, I say modernism unleashed. We really have, I've been talking a little bit about modernism. What do I mean by modernism exactly? I want to talk a little bit about that just for a second. Again, psychological depth, a newfound sensitivity, but also and clarity, but also a newfound kind of articulateness, a newfound prolixity, a newfound desire to talk about the quality of subjective experience. Of course, that's what the French Impressionist painters were all about. Now that's out there, and we have, in fact, the next video that we'll do here will be about modernist literature. We're not doing architecture, but in architecture, the period is also definitely called modernist architecture. And I am going to do a video for you and a couple from now called modernist sculpture. Modernist painting is probably a better name for these painters than post-impressionist. All post-impressionist means is, and I guess I should probably go on to the next slide for this, since this is what the slide is about. So more a period than a genre. Again, a post-impressionist really pointing towards a period of time. The Impressionism had happened. The old regime had kind of been exploded, and all of these new ideas are coming in. And so now there's a newfound freedom. There's both a newfound freedom and a new heavy influence from the Impressionists. Also, though, at the same time, there are blowbacks. There are people saying, well, Impressionism lacks this or that. So again, even the timeline of it, the period of post-impressionism is vague. Again, for me, I just kind of identify it with modernism. And for me, I have a fairly broad notion of modernism from sort of the fin de siècle, the end of the century period, from about 1880 on, and then up in really into the 1920s, I would say, is sort of roughly the modernist period. Other people, including art historians, might, someone talking about painting specifically might say the modernist period was something more specific than that. But I'm, again, painting, if you'll pardon the pun, with a broad brush here. Again, an essential influence, the Impressionists in particular, this aim of capturing something about subjectivity, something about human experience, sort of the new humanism of modernism. Remember Freud and all of that, but also people saying, well, we want other things too. We want to break out of some of these new conventions. I'll talk about symbolism. So basically, symbolism, something different here than we usually maybe mean by it when we're talking about post-impressionist symbolism in the post-impressionist period, because the idea was that the French Impressionists, with their interest in the quotidian and the here and now, simply sort of painted scenes of everyday life. And symbolism then isn't necessarily having an owl up in the corner that means something. Symbolism is also having the image also be expressive of some universal feeling or universal insight or universal moral. And this time was also the same time as French symbolist poetry. All symbolism in that sense also misunderstood if we take it as real literally. Okay, and then the other thing that I think makes it modernist painting, the last bullet point there, is you've got all that new psychological insight and all that new political insight and sort of political radicalism really that characterizes the early 20th century. So Gaugin, an interesting character, best known for his late Polynesian paintings. He has many paintings from before then, from before he first went out there. Actually, his first tropical paintings are from a stop he made in Martinique in the Caribbean, where we have some, I think there's a landscape in here from there. So modernism, Orientalism, and we see this also very much in Picasso and Picasso's fascination, for example, with tribal masks, both from Africa and from the New World. Gaugin, of course, is out there. He's sort of gone out to the South Pacific. He's gone out to Tahiti. But he too is interested in this. And so it's part of that new freedom of breaking out of the bounds of a more formal regime with art. Now you have a wide open art scene, so people are incorporating these influences, these international influences. And then again, second bullet point, that different sense of symbolism in history of painting maybe, where symbolism you would often take to mean specific images or figures as symbols. Of course, we've seen looking at the history of painting that was an intricately evolved thing to do, to put specific symbolic images in paintings just forever. But in modernist art, symbolism is, again, this sense of we're going to, again, aspire to the universal. And the idea was that the Impressionists didn't do that in their art, in their choice of subjects and so on. And then something we're going to talk about a good bit today is Favism. What does Favism mean? Literally, it means sort of like a wild animal. Why call anybody that? Mostly because of their approach to colors. Their approach to colors was considered to be wild. But they also pushed this sort of using perspective or the lack of perspective as another mode of expression. And so that's another thing that makes them Favist. And then with the Orientalism and the Favism, we could have another ism, which might be Primitivism. There's another painter from this period, Henri Rousseau. And so you get to something that has a sort of what a European would think of as a primitive kind of look to it, a folkloric look to it. There's Gaugin, quite the character, really, quite the eventful life. Yeah, at the pond. This is 1887. Actually, he is in the Caribbean, and he had gone to Venezuela for a couple of years, by the way, where he painted in Venezuela, and he went to Martinique. And that was when he first got his first sight of the tropical landscape and tropical people, which was to fascinate him throughout his life. When we talk about Favism, you see sort of the colors are not run together. There's sort of strict outlines, and then obviously symbolism. When will you marry? Now he's out in Tahiti. Let me get my little thing away from the date there. Some of these faces are recognizable from painting to painting. He was interested in what they thought about death, since, of course, they didn't have Christian views about death. Day of the God, and these strange landscapes. Notice the treatment of colors again with Gaugin. He was with Van Gogh. This is perhaps his most iconic painting, Two Tahitian Women, from 1899. 1898, remember, being the Spanish-American War. So we've got sort of this late phase colonialism going on. Not to kill the buzz, not to kill the buzz, because he's a really fun painter, and a lot of these big landscapes that he does, and he has many more of these portraits of these Polynesian women that are also very beautiful. So Gauguin's actually really a great painter. He is a little politically problematic, maybe. Painted what he saw. Seurat. Seurat, and pardon me if you're French, actually, and for my pronunciation of French names. I mean, I don't know. Okay, George Seurat. He is a technician. I mean, his paintings are interesting paintings, and he's very distinctive. You can't miss a Seurat from a mile away. But I think it is because of some technical contributions that he made that really were influential. And some of the other painters that we look at when we look at postmodernist painters actually incorporated or have works in the style and technique of Seurat. The technique, what does that mean? Well, mostly what we know about Seurat is pointillism. What is pointillism? The idea that instead of brush strokes, you're putting dots, you're putting individual dots onto the page and you're composing it that way. I say on that second bullet point there, it's prophetic in terms of digital reproduction and mechanized reproduction. Seurat understood something there. And ideally, I mean, in the way, say, a digital television works is by activating these color nodes, and they're not actually mixed. So anyway, that's interesting. And everybody, I think if people have heard of Georges Seurat, they've probably heard of pointillism and the idea that it's composition using dots rather than strokes. Actually, there's one other thing, though, about it. It's not necessarily pointillistic, and that is divisionism is the ism word. Seurat himself used the word chromoluminism, which is a fun word. But remember, I showed you also with the Impressionist painters that they created an effect, a kind of airy light effect, by not mixing the primary colors. So this was already, so working on this notion of trying to make the colors pop, basically. And Seurat's theory was that you could get sort of maximum luminosity. You could get the colors coming, if you had actually pure rather than blended colors put together in these dots. Here he is, Georges Seurat. This is probably his most well-known painting. It's the Sunday afternoon down at this place on the river where people used to go to, a big park. So you can see that this painting is composed out of points. I'm not sure. I mean, it would be, I would want to know exactly if there are accounts of Seurat actually making these paintings, putting the dots on the painting. Someone must describe that, what that was like and what kind of a process that was. And as far as his aspirations with color, I mean, certainly he achieves a texture and a look that's completely different. Technically, this painting is composed in a completely different way. And here we see a very fine-grained, this painting looking much more naturalistic. Look at the surface of the water, industrial scenes in the back, and kind of classic using pointillism. Pointillism, as I mentioned, I mean, what we understand with digital computation is that something like pointillism can indeed give you sort of the finest grain in terms of trying to pick out details. So, Van Gogh. A lot of these painters, again, it's modernism, I think, would be better than post-impressionism, because modernism captures the ideas that they share, that they clearly do share. Van Gogh, a man who had serious mental health problems, who was known to other artists, but wasn't known to the public at all. But nonetheless, he clearly is also familiar with these ideas that I'm calling modernist ideas, and he clearly has well digested the Impressionist movement. I think one of the most striking things that makes Van Gogh's paintings so charismatic, for me certainly, is this impasto. That's the third bullet point on the slide. If you see Van Gogh in person, and you can get up to the paintings, one of the nice things about them is you can see the way the paint is really piled onto the painting, sometimes really getting up to a quarter of an inch off the surface. So you've got sort of big scoops of paint around, and it gives the painting this really unique texture. There's absolutely nothing else that looks like a Van Gogh. Now, Van Gogh synesthesia is in a syndrome that ordinary people have. It's not necessarily a pathology, but it's also very common with schizophrenic people. And that is, for example, seeing tastes or smelling colors, or very commonly, say, the sound of a trumpet, they will tell you has a certain color that it evokes. I'm pretty sure that that was true about Van Gogh, both looking at his paintings and the immense significance of the colors that he chooses. He said that he thought the colors had a kind of moral weight. He said the colors were more than just representing the colors of the surfaces of what was being painted, but there was more to the colors than that. They had a kind of moral weight. So, so the thing that relates him to these other painters that we've been looking at in terms of color is that then sometimes his colors are what we could call very strange. I mean, or that is very strange by any conventional standards. They're very beautiful use of color, but sometimes a very odd use of color. He has this odd pastel green color that he likes to have in the background a lot, especially in the very many self-portraits that he does, such as this one. We'll look later at a self-portrait that he makes after he cuts his ear off. But here's an earlier one. Again, if you saw this painting in person, you would see that all of those brushstrokes, including the brushstrokes of his hair, but also in the background, had this impasto effect of being sort of raised up, sort of streaks of paint. Just couldn't resist showing his skull with burning cigarette from 1886. And even on these more realistic canvases, the way he puts the paint on the canvas is unmistakable. Now, this one, too, is a personal favorite, because I was over in Amsterdam, and they have the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. It's over by the Rijksmuseum, where you can go to see the Rembrandts and everything. And, you know, so I went to Amsterdam, and I was hanging out in, you know, the city a little bit. And then I went over to check out the Van Gogh Museum, you know, and on the landing was this thing, the courtesan. It's a really big painting, and it's in that impasto style, but it's this intricately detailed painting of a courtesan, of a geisha. It's Japanese, and yikes! I mean, and I had no idea that there was any kind of painting like this that Van Gogh had done. So when I walked into the Van Gogh Museum and then walked upstairs and saw this, the first thing I saw when I walked upstairs, was really one of my greatest Van Gogh experiences. Another one was one time I was at a conference in Boston, and I used to work at Harvard in the preservation department in Widener, so I thought I'd take the T up there and poke around to get away from the conference downtown Boston. And I went into the museum on Harvard Yard, and they had this exhibit of Van Gogh's portraits, and I guess he had some where he's painted his portrait on both sides of the thing. And it was the middle of the day, and there was nobody else there. It was me and the guard, and I just hung around looking at these. So they had a whole bunch of these self-portraits of Van Gogh, and I just had the whole place to myself. So that was a great afternoon. So those are my two favorite, you know, Van Gogh live stories. Anyway, this painting, I mean, first of all, look at this amazing painting, but also the treatment of color there, definitely thinking about the same kinds of things that Seurat and before him the Impressionists are thinking, not mixing those blues and reds, just putting them side by side. And you see just the extraordinary light in the air. Of course, he does endless series of sunflowers. So again, it's Monet who does the water lilies and Van Gogh who does the sunflowers. So when you get your job with Boeing making nuclear submarines in Seattle and you go to the wine and cheese reception, remember you took our class, and it's Van Gogh who makes the sunflowers, and then the water lilies are by Monet, okay? And then that'll get you through. These sunflower paintings, I remember when someone gave $15 million for one, and that was the most outrageous thing anyone heard. Nowadays, 150 million, maybe even literally. here you see this again, this treatment of, the thing is, he's like Monet, Van Gogh is, in that he sort of looks like he couldn't care less about perspective, and yet somehow he just magically achieves effects of perspective, which are just extraordinary. And I don't know how they do it, but I don't know how they do anything. One of his most famous paintings, Starry Night, a beautiful painting. The treatment of stars is in a number of paintings. If you like that, there's more paintings like this. But this is another painting where if you saw it in person, you would see that those streaks in the sky are really piled up paint. That's really piled up sort of dunes of paint that he's put on there with a knife, with like a putty knife. And the texture of it is really just amazing. Here's a self-portrait with the bandaged ear. He cut off his ear in a violent self-abusive episode. And then in 1890, he shot himself. He was a man who, never was recognized, and his parents, his father thought he should go to an insane asylum. His brother, Theo, was the one who always helped him, but he had a very hard life indeed, and he ended up committing suicide. This is 1890, the year that he died. So this is a painting that's, some months before he committed suicide. And the thing that I would show you two things about this painting. One is the brush strokes, and here in the painting you can see it very, very clearly, just as with the Impressionists. So Post-Impressionist, well, just as with them, the actual mechanics of putting the paint on the paper is just completely exposed, right? It's just the machinery is just right out there for everyone to see. And so you're being able to literally see each application of paint onto the canvas and still have this incredibly evocative landscape is part of the sort of trick of the genius. But the other thing is, this is a painting by a disturbed person, and we know that he thinks that colors are speaking to him. He's got a relationship with colors that's not clear exactly what representational function they have, because he says they have one. So with Van Gogh, you can feel close enough to Van Gogh to start thinking that it's a little almost sort of intrusive because the paintings are so personal. All right, Henri Matisse. And I'm going to have to apologize for that unfinished slide there. This is live recording over pre-typed up PowerPoints. So the worst thing in these is that I make terrible mistakes sometimes. That, what are you going to do? You have to shoot the whole thing over. Anyway, well, intense use of color, Favism, Matisse takes the color and detaches the notion of color from this sort of representational function. Students will often just say, look, the cameras are doing the representational stuff and the artists are going off into other directions. And these very self-conscious sort of intellectual painters like Seurat and Matisse will sell exactly the same thing. They had that idea. They understood that very well. Another thing about Matisse, he got older and he couldn't really paint the way he used to, and he started working more with collage. Picasso, we'll see, also uses collage. When we say synthetic cubism, that's mostly referring to Picasso's increasing incorporation of collage into his work during those years. And a lot of other similarities between Matisse and Picasso. There's Matisse looking very French painter-ish. So Favism, Woman with a Hat from 1905. Favism, the colors are now just plainly not realistic, but also unsubdued, sort of left to run riot, but then that's how the painter is expressing himself. And so, again, you see what's meant also by primitivism in the sense of kind of a folkloric, by flattening out the artfulness of it and getting into a purer style. And Matisse at his best has a beautiful sinuous line with nudes and the human form, extremely expressive positions and postures on all of his human figures. Just a natural at that. One version of the dance, he did quite a number of them. There's ones with more natural color than this. This was his favorite one. It's iconic. The Red Studio, and here again you see a real flattening out because he's interested in color and he's interested in visual relationships. They're very technical people. With Picasso, we'll even have to maybe talk about Einstein a little bit. Speaking of Picasso, Matisse also there, look how early this painting is, 1915, clearly interested by Cubist ideas. Georges Braque was another. In fact, Georges Braque and Picasso were the inventors of Cubist theory together. And the thing about Matisse is he's making these paintings along with them at the time. And so Matisse is one of the very few painters who can actually claim to be a sort of past master of some of these things like Cubism or Favism that we only associate with one or two artists. And throughout his life, like Picasso, throughout his life, Matisse continues to make paintings, beautiful paintings with beautiful and audacious approaches to color. And as I say, these are, I'll show you just, I guess, two of collages. This is one of his most famous images as well. Again, working with collage. He is partially paralyzed. He's in a wheelchair and he has trouble with his hands such that it's difficult for him to paint with a brush. So he starts to do collage. Another thing he has in common with Picasso, Cubism and collage. A late collage from the 1950s. Is that the end? Yeah, that's the end. Okay. So as I say, just a lot of really, really nice art here. And I think that you can see that they do have things in common. There are ideas that are in the air. You can see the way they're feeding off of each other. I talked about Cezanne in the Impressionist video, but you could just as well, many people consider Cezanne sort of a father of Post-Impressionism. Again, if you call it modernism, it sort of makes more sense. But if you were going to look at other painters, I would recommend Cezanne and Pissarro, Camille Pissarro, the ones that we looked at today, again, Matisse and Van Gogh. All right, so very nice paintings. So choose your favorite artist and go find out more about them. I'll give you links to them all so you can look at more paintings.